There's a silence you learn to fear when you spend enough time alone in the wilderness. It's not the quiet between bird calls or the pause in the wind. It's a heavy, absolute stillness, the kind that feels like the world is holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. That's the silence I heard the night my dog, Fonzie, saved my life. We were in the foothills of Mount Baker, just me and him, and the woods that stretched out like a dark ocean. He was my protector, a mix of Chow and German Shepherd, fearless and loyal to a fault. I was just 8 years old, plinking away at targets with my BB gun as dusk settled over the Pacific Northwest. He was sitting behind me, a silent guardian, when suddenly he was on his feet, a low growl rumbling in his chest. He only ever did that when he sensed real danger. He moved in front of me, a wall of fur and teeth between me and the tree line. And then we heard it, a sound from the trees, maybe 20 feet away, a deep, loud, almost clicking noise that vibrated in my bones. Branches snapped, the ground pounded as if something immense was charging us. We were both terrified. Fonzie, my brave dog who had never backed down from anything, started to whimper. We ran. We scrambled back to the house, and I slammed the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I peeked out the window, expecting to see a bear or a cougar, but there was nothing. Just the darkening woods and the oppressive silence that had returned. When I told my dad, he laughed it off. "Oh yeah, probably Bigfoot," he said, not believing a word. But I know what I heard. I know the fear I saw in my dog's eyes. Black. Bears in our area run from a barking dog, and it was far too loud, far too heavy to be a cougar. I'm 31 now, and that memory still haunts me. It was the first time I realized that some things in the woods don't have a name, and that the deepest fears are born from the things we can't explain. Years later, as a scout leader in Ireland, I tried to teach kids to respect the outdoors, to understand its rhythms and noises. But some nights, there are sounds that defy explanation. One trip, we were camping in Roscommon, about 4 of us crammed into a dome tent. Sometime in the dead of night, we all heard it, a distinct rustling and moving just outside the fabric wall. We were all terrified, too scared to even speak, each of us lying perfectly still, pretending to be asleep. It wasn't until we were huddled over breakfast the next morning that we dared to mention it. That's when the 2 others, sleeping in separate tents, spoke up. They'd heard it too, not just rustling, but something rubbing along the side of their tents, a heavy, deliberate pressure. We tried to convince ourselves it was a wild animal, maybe a deer, but we were the only campers on the site. Surely an animal would steer clear of a noisy campsite? Another time, while wild camping near Glendalough, several of us woke up multiple times to the sound of our tent zipper. Not a small jingle, but the distinct sound of the exterior door being zipped fully open or closed. There were 2 tents, but we'd all decided to pile into one because of the biting cold. It wasn't one of us playing a prank. We peered out, but the door was secure. The sound happened again and again that night, a phantom hand opening a door that never moved. You learn to ignore things when you're out in the wild. You have to, or the fear will consume you. Most nights camping, you don't get much sleep anyway. You're always hyper-aware of how exposed you are, a thin layer of nylon separating you from the vast, indifferent wilderness. You can never be sure what's truly out there, just beyond the firelight. That same feeling of being watched, of something just beyond your perception, followed me into my work as a wildland firefighter in a remote part of Arizona. I worked in the southern portion of a forest, a place with few roads and even fewer people. Our crew had a duty station hours away from anything, a place with no cell reception where the nights were so dark they felt solid. My supervisor, a seasoned woodsman, had his own strange encounters there. He told me about a night he was cowboy camping, sleeping out under the stars without a tent. He kept feeling a weird, mucusy drop of liquid hitting his face. He'd sit up, yell into the darkness, but no one was there. He insisted he wasn't under any trees, so it couldn't have been sap. He never slept outside there again, and the look in his eyes when he told me the story made me believe him completely. My own turn came on the 4th of July. We weren't on a fire, so the crew was just relaxing, playing horseshoes. Everyone turned in early. I had my own small room in the double-wide trailer we used for housing, my bed pushed up against a large window. I was in that state between wakefulness and sleep when I heard one of my co-workers outside my window asking me to come out. I was lying on my side, facing the window, but I didn't look up. I could feel their presence, a tall shadow looming over me from the other side of the glass. The voice kept beckoning, pleading. I said no, and almost immediately the voice changed. It became a deep, raspy, angry snarl. It started cursing at me, a demonic, guttural sound that was definitely not my co-workers. "Get the F outside," it commanded. I froze, paralyzed with a fear so profound I couldn't move or scream. The voice raged and yelled, and then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I fell asleep, though I don't know how. The next morning, I wanted to ask my coworker if he had been outside my window, but the words wouldn't come. It just felt too bizarre, too insane to ask. Maybe it was sleep paralysis, a trick of a tired mind. But whatever it was, standing in the bright Arizona sun, the memory of that voice and the feeling of that towering presence just outside the glass felt terrifyingly real. It seems that some places, no matter how beautiful, hold a darkness that can't be explained. A few years ago, in the northern part of Sweden, I was out for an evening of fishing. I also worked as a fishing supervisor, checking licenses in a remote area of lakes and streams. I often ended my rounds at a small, perfectly round lake deep in the forest, a place that looked like a crater. I had been there dozens of times and had never seen another person. It was a warm summer evening, birds chirping, fish rising on the surface. I rigged my fly rod, aimed for a rising trout, and cast. The instant my fly touched the water, it was as if someone hit a pause button on the universe. The sun vanished behind a cloud. The wind died. The birds fell silent. A smell rose from the ground, the putrid stench of something dead and rotten, as if a carcass was buried right beneath my feet. And then I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that something was walking out of the forest behind me. I could almost see it in my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement that my brain refused to process. Every hair on my body stood on end, and a sudden intense cold enveloped me. The thing, whatever it was, just stood there, watching. I was too terrified to turn around. My fly sank to the bottom of the lake, but I couldn't move a muscle. I was trapped by a primal fear. Then, just as abruptly, the wind returned, carrying the awful smell away. The sun reappeared, a bird began to sing, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched vanished. I spun around. Nothing. On the lake, the fish started rising again. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear into my backpack and ran. I sprinted through the forest to my car, slammed the door, and drove like a maniac until I hit the main road and saw the lights of civilization. I pulled over, my heart still racing, and whispered to myself, "What the heck was that?" I have never been back to that lake, and I have never been able to shake the feeling that on that perfect summer evening, I was in the presence of something ancient and utterly malevolent. Sometimes the horror isn't in a remote forest, but right next door. When I was 12, my family moved into a semi-detached house. Our neighbors were a lovely family, an English husband, a Norwegian wife, and their 2 young children, a 3-year-old girl and a 6-month-old baby boy. I was eager to start babysitting, and since my parents would be right on the other side of the wall, it seemed like the perfect first job. One Friday night, they hired me. The parents were going to a party just down the street and told me they'd be back between 2 and 3 in the morning. Both kids were already sound asleep. They were the easiest kids imaginable. Once they were down for the night, nothing could wake them. I settled on the couch on the 2nd floor to watch a movie. The kids' bedrooms were downstairs, near the front door. The layout was small enough that if the TV wasn't too loud, I could hear everything happening on the 1st floor. Around midnight, I heard the front door unlock. I heard my neighbors walk in, talking quietly as they took off their jackets and shoes. I thought it was a bit strange they hadn't called to say they were coming home early, but I shrugged it off and went downstairs to greet them. I could hear their conversation right up until I turned the corner into the hallway leading to the door. And then there was nobody there. The moment I came into view of the door, the talking stopped. The only sound was the movie playing on the TV upstairs. My heart began to pound in my chest. I ran to the kids' rooms to check on them. They were sleeping soundly. I searched the entire house, opening every closet, checking every corner, looking for any explanation. There was nothing. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. I went back upstairs, but as I sat down, I noticed the TV was off. I had left it on. When I tried to turn it back on, the screen was just snow. I couldn't get it to work. That's when the talking started again downstairs. But this time, it was followed by the baby screaming bloody murder. This was a baby who never, ever woke up from his sleep, let alone screamed like that. I have never moved faster in my life. I flew down the stairs and rushed toward the baby's room, only to find the door, which I had left open, was now closed. I ripped it open, scooped up the wailing baby, and then grabbed his sister from her room. I took them both upstairs and held them on the couch, my body trembling for almost 3 hours until the parents finally came home. The talking downstairs would come and go, faint whispers and murmurs. When the parents walked in, they found me clutching their children, my face pale with fear. They asked what happened, and though I felt like I was losing my mind, I told them everything. They didn't look surprised. They told me it wasn't the first time. They heard the voices all the time at night. They apologized for not warning me. The mom walked me home and I slept with the lights on for a month. I did go back to babysit for them again. And every so often I'd hear those faint, impossible sounds from downstairs, a constant reminder that we weren't alone in that house. The feeling of a place being wrong isn't limited to houses. There was an old ammunition depot from World War II deep in the woods of eastern New Brunswick, a place my friends and I used to go off-roading. It was a massive crumbling structure you could drive right through, with an old admin building on a hill nearby. We'd been there dozens of times. One night, a dozen of us were having a fire inside the main building when we all saw and heard something huge scramble up the side of the concrete wall and then start running across the roof. There is nothing in the woods of eastern Canada that should be able to run up the side of a 4-story building in seconds. Maybe a black bear could climb it, but not like that. This thing was impossibly fast. We didn't stick around to find out what it was. We piled into our trucks and got out of there as fast as we could. On another occasion, we were exploring the 3-story admin building. It had been abandoned since the war. We made it to the top floor without incident, but on our way back down, we found something on the second floor that made our blood run cold. An entire room was filled with hundreds of lit candles, their flames flickering in the dark, empty space. But there was nobody there, no sign of anyone. We ran out of there so fast. That one could have been a prank, I guess. Lots of people went out there to mess around. But the thing that climbed the building? To this day, none of us can explain what we saw. It was big, it was fast, and it defied the laws of nature. It's one thing to hear a story, but it's another thing entirely to be one of a dozen witnesses to something that simply should not be possible. Sometimes the unknown manifests not as a creature, but as a presence that defies physics. A few years ago, I was visiting Tucson, Arizona for the first time. On our first night, my friend and our host took me out to see the city. We ended up walking home around 1:30 in the morning. The streets were mostly quiet. We were a couple of blocks from the oldest bar in Tucson when my friend suddenly said, "Don't freak out, but there's a guy in a cape walking toward us." I looked up, and my stomach dropped. A man in a thick black hooded cloak was walking down the very middle of the street with a slow, heavy gait. He immediately made me feel uneasy. As soon as we spotted him, he started to veer from the center of the road toward our side, as if he intended to step up onto the sidewalk and confront us. My heart started racing. We kept walking, but slowed down, anticipating his move. There were cars parked diagonally along the curb. The man stepped between two of them to get to the sidewalk, but he never emerged. We got closer expecting him to jump out, but he was just gone. He wasn't between the cars. He wasn't in them. He had vanished. That would have been terrifying enough. But then I looked up. There he was again, now nearly 20 feet ahead of us, back in the middle of the street, but this time walking away from us, toward the brightly lit bar. I became fixated on him, trying to process what was happening. I could see his black boots under the hem of his cloak, which swayed heavily with each lumbering step. He looked huge, powerful, and just as solid as anyone else on the street. As he neared the bar, he veered toward the entrance again. Just as he stepped onto the sidewalk, two women walked out of the bar. They should have run right into him, but they walked straight past, never acknowledging his presence, as if he were completely invisible. He stopped right under the big bright sign above the entrance, perfectly illuminated. I could see now that he was impossibly tall. The top of his hood was only inches below the sign, taller than the doorframe itself. And then I noticed the strangest thing of all. His feet were stuck mid-step, one foot in front of the other, heel to the ground, and he was just rocking back and forth like a computer glitch in reality, stuck in the motion of taking a step. Our drunk friend said something that made me glance away for a fraction of a second, and when I looked back, he was gone. We even went into the bar, but there was no sign of him. His presence hadn't felt evil, but realizing he wasn't human was profoundly unsettling. The rest of that trip felt strange. My friendship with the woman I traveled with began to deteriorate rapidly after that night, as if our encounter with that entity had somehow changed the trajectory of our lives. We're no longer friends, and in a strange way, my life has been better ever since. I'll always wonder if that cloaked figure had something to do with it, a silent observer who could step between the moments of our world. The idea that unseen things can influence our lives is terrifying. I used to think ghouls were just Halloween monsters, but after years of research, I believe they are real, synonymous with the creatures people now call crawlers. In Arabic folklore, the ghoul is a desert-dwelling, shape-shifting demon that dwells in cemeteries and other desolate places. It lures travelers into the wilderness to kill and devour them. It preys on children, drinks blood, and eats the dead. It's often described as bipedal, but with a hunched form, sometimes crawling or running on all fours like an animal. In the United States, with our forests and abandoned places, the stories are eerily similar. People report encounters with pale, hunched humanoid creatures in deep woods and near cemeteries. I've come to believe these aren't just creatures. They are interdimensional demons. The late Father Malachi Martin once wrote about a dimension devoid of love and compassion, all the qualities that make us human. I believe it is from that dimension that these things come. They are beings of pure malice, able to shift their form and feed on the dead. I used to dismiss the stories as folklore, but the more I research, the more eyewitness accounts I find from credible people. The consistency in the descriptions from all over the world is chilling. These aren't just scary stories for a campfire. They are warnings. We need to be vigilant. There are things in the empty places of the world that are not meant to be encountered, things that see us only as prey, and sometimes those things mimic sounds to draw you in. I was out rockhounding by myself in a secluded creek in northern Alabama. It was a familiar spot, a rock bar in the middle of the creek with dense forest on either side. About an hour in, I was focused on digging through some clay when I heard it, a distinct meow. I stood up, confused. There were no houses for miles. 10 minutes later, I heard it again. Yep, that was a cat, I thought, but it felt wrong. A deep sense of unease settled over me, and I decided to head back to my gear. The meow itself was strange. It wasn't a meow of pain or hunger, just a flat, matter-of-fact sound. 5 minutes into my walk back, I heard it again. My blood ran cold. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I knew what I was hearing wasn't a cat. It sounded like something was imitating a cat. A perfect but soulless mimicry. I picked up my pace, and 5 minutes later, another meow. And that's when the real horror set in. No matter how far or fast I walked, the meow always sounded like it was the exact same distance away from me. It wasn't getting closer or farther. It was pacing me, maintaining a constant, invisible perimeter. I finally reached my spot on the rock bar, and the meow sounded again. And this time I knew with every fiber of my being that I was being followed by something intelligent and predatory. I calmly gathered my gear, my hands shaking, and started to wade across the creek toward the path to my car. Another long, drawn-out meow echoed from the trees. I finally made it to my car, which was parked at the edge of the forest. I fumbled with my keys, threw my gear in the back, and dove into the driver's seat. As I slammed the door and peeled out of there, I couldn't shake the thought of that sound. The logical answer is that someone was messing with me, but it's a 200-acre forest that people rarely visit. How could they have followed me so perfectly without me hearing a single twig snap or leaf crunch? And why? What was the purpose of that perfect, chilling meow that followed me through the woods? To this day, I can't explain it, but I know that something was out there, and it was not a cat. The sounds aren't always mimicry. Sometimes they are completely alien. In a small city in Alaska where I grew up, I experienced something I couldn't explain for years. One night around midnight, I was lying awake when I started to hear a bizarre, obnoxious noise. It sounded like a mix between a clarinet and a trumpet. But there was no melody, just loud, discordant screeches, squeaks, and honks echoing through the cold night air. It was loud enough to hear clearly inside, so I went out onto my front porch to listen. It was a strange acoustic phenomenon. It sounded like it was a few blocks away, but at the same time, it seemed to be coming from every direction at once. It was a cold autumn night, and I was so frustrated by the racket that I actually yelled, "Shut up!" into the darkness, assuming it was some kid playing a prank. A year or two passed, and I had almost forgotten about it when I heard the sound again, this time during the day, in the dead of winter. It lasted for a few hours and then stopped. It wasn't until about 5 years later that I was watching YouTube and stumbled upon a video called Trumpets in the Sky. It was a compilation of videos from people all around the world who had recorded the exact same noises, those strange, metallic, apocalyptic sounds echoing from an unseen source. Hearing those recordings gave me chills. It was the same sound. I had no idea what it was then, and I have no idea now, but knowing that people across the globe have experienced the same impossible sound makes it even more terrifying. What is making that noise? And why does it seem to be happening everywhere? My friend and I encountered something equally unexplainable on the Appalachian Trail in Blue Ridge, Georgia. We were camping for the night near Blood Mountain, a place with its own dark history. My friend told me a story about another hiker who had heard voices and footsteps there, so intense he had to pack up and hike out in the middle of the night. As it got dark, we both got that familiar, unsettling feeling of being watched. Then it started. We saw a pair of red, glowing eyes in the darkness, about 100 feet from our campfire. They just stared, unblinking. A little later, my friend went to the creek to splash his face, and he swears something pushed him into the water. He came back with a soaked shirt and a bloody nose from hitting a rock. After that, we started hearing a woman's voice. We could never make out the words, but it moved. First, it was in front of us, then behind us, then across the creek to our left, where there was no trail. If it was another hiker, they weren't using a flashlight. We also heard footsteps circling our campsite, sticks and twigs snapping just outside the firelight. Finally, we gave up and crawled into the tent, hoping for some safety. My friend fell asleep quickly, but I lay awake, my ears straining against the fabric of the tent. And then I heard it, a twig snapping right next to my head, just on the other side of the thin nylon wall. Our night was filled with these small, terrifying moments. We never saw what was making the noises, other than those two red eyes. But we knew we weren't alone. If you decide to go camping in Blue Ridge, just know that there are things out there lurking in the night. Things that watch you from the darkness and whisper in voices you can't quite understand. Sometimes, the experience is less about what you see or hear and more about an oppressive feeling that something is fundamentally wrong. When I was a kid, my dad used to take my brother and me to my grandparents' house in the middle of nowhere, North Carolina. We were left to wander the fields and woods for hours. Behind my great-uncle's house was a place we called the car graveyard, a field filled with the rusted husks of old cars he had stripped for scrap. It was an eerie place on its own, with cars from the 50s being swallowed by the forest. Sometimes we'd find deer bones in odd places, like a skull placed perfectly on the hood of a car. One day, we were heading toward the car graveyard when we heard what sounded like pained moaning coming from deep within the wreckage. We turned and ran. But the strangest experience happened when we decided to see just how far back the cars went. The trail of wrecks continued deep into the woods, with trees growing right through engine blocks. Ahead of us, we saw what looked like a patch of thick fog or mist, which was strange for a clear mid-afternoon. We were just kids, so we didn't think much of it and walked right through it. The moment we passed through the mist, everything felt inexplicably weird. It's hard to describe, but the world on the other side felt off. When we got back to my granddad's house, he looked like our granddad, and my dad looked like my dad, but they didn't feel the same. My brother felt it too. We got this wild idea that we had stepped into another dimension, one just slightly different from our own. The feeling of not belonging, of being an imposter in our own family was so oppressive and terrifying that we booked it back to the woods, found that patch of fog, and ran through it again. The instant we emerged on the other side, the world felt right again. The oppressive feeling lifted like a veil. We were kids, and maybe it was just our imaginations running wild. But I went back to that spot as an adult. The fog was gone, but there was a palpable, off-putting sensation in that part of the woods, a lingering wrongness that I could still feel after all those years. A creepy encounter I had in the fall of 2001 still bothers me. My family lived in a house surrounded by dense woods with four-wheeler trails snaking everywhere. One day, a friend came over to spend the night, and we rode around for hours. Eventually, we got bored and decided to ride down the main road to a fire training center about 3 miles away. The center was down a one-lane gravel road so narrow that trees scraped the sides of any car that drove down it. At the end was a locked gate. On our way there, we passed a small pickup truck with 2 men inside. When we got to the end of the road, we found a little trail that went around the gate, but lying right in the middle of it was a dead dog wrapped in a blanket. We didn't want to run it over, so we turned around and headed back. About halfway back to my house, we passed the same small pickup truck with the same 2 men. We joked that they were following us because they knew we saw the dog they dumped. We decided to try again, thinking maybe there was another way around the dog on the other side of the gate. So we went back down that narrow gravel road. There was no other trail. We sat there for a few minutes, and I tried to convince my friend to just tug the corner of the blanket to move the dog, but she refused. Finally, we gave up and turned around to go home for good. We started back down the gravel road, and as we rounded the first turn onto the straight part, my heart stopped. The small pickup truck was parked in the middle of the road, completely blocking our only way out. The trees were so close on either side that there was no way to go around it. The 2 large men just sat in the cab staring at us. After what felt like an eternity of frozen silence, I whipped the four-wheeler around, sped back toward the gate, and rode over the corner of the blanket and through the trail, not stopping until we were safely away. That road only led to the locked fire training center. A car that drives down it has to back all the way out. They had been waiting for us. Were they watching us the whole time, hidden in the trees? What would have happened if we had moved that blanket? Those questions still scare me today as much as they did back then. Babysitting always seems to be a magnet for the strange and terrifying. When I was 13, I regularly babysat a sweet little girl named Emma. The house had an open concept front half with the living room, dining room, and kitchen all connected. An open doorway led to the back hall, where Emma's room was at one end and her parents' room at the other. One night around 10:30, after I had put Emma to bed, I was sitting on the couch channel surfing. I heard what sounded like someone running down the hall to the parents' bathroom. Assuming it was Emma, I didn't think much of it. A few minutes later, I heard the pitter-patter of feet heading back down the hall. I turned to tell her to go back and make sure she flushed, because I hadn't heard the toilet. But as I looked toward the doorway, I only saw the tips of black hair zip past the opening. Here's the problem. Emma was a blonde. My blood ran cold. I jumped up and rushed to Emma's room, throwing open the door. Her nightlight cast enough of a glow for me to see her sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes in confusion. I asked her if she had just gone to the bathroom. She shook her head no. I quickly checked her room under the bed, in the closet, but saw nothing. I told her I was just checking for monsters, tucked her back in, and said goodnight. As I was leaving her room, I stopped when I heard her small voice speak into the quiet. I thought she was going to call me back, but instead I heard her say, "You should have said something. Don't scare her. I really like her." I never said anything to her mom about it, but I kept babysitting. After that night, I always made an effort to include the second child I was apparently watching. If Emma was drawing, I'd set up an extra spot. If she was eating, I'd set up another chair. Emma seemed happy about it, and nothing ever startled me in that house again. But it still weirds me out to think about who she was talking to that night, and who or what had run down that hallway with jet black hair. The feeling of being unwelcome can be one of the most primal fears, especially when you're alone in the backcountry. I went backpacking by myself over a long weekend at a beautiful high-elevation lake. It was accessible by a short trail, so there were a few other campers around. I was sitting at my camp reading when a guy in his mid-20s with a fishing pole walked by. A few minutes later, he doubled back and said hello. I said hi and tried to go back to my book, but without any invitation, he sat down on a stump right next to me, invading my personal space. He started asking creepy, probing questions that were phrased as statements. "So, you're just reading?" he said, then looked at my tent. "Oh, you're staying the night here. Alone, huh?" His tone was amused, and his vibe was just completely off. I was so uncomfortable I could barely form words. His eyes were dead and dark, and they just drilled into me. He then pulled out a beer, lit a cigarette, and started blowing the smoke directly at me. I was paralyzed with anxiety. Thankfully, another hiker wandered by, and he struck up a conversation with them. I used the opportunity to pretend I needed to get water and walk down to the shore, filtering it as slowly as possible. He kept looking over in my direction. Eventually, I went back and got inside my tent, hoping he would leave me alone. About 20 minutes later, he popped out from behind my tent and stood just a foot from my mesh door, looking down at me. He didn't say anything. He just started laughing, a creepy fake laugh. I finally managed to ask, "What?" His response was, "This is just really funny." I felt sick to my stomach. I told him I was taking a nap and to have a good night. He laughed again and thankfully walked away. I saw him wandering around for the rest of the evening, with no real purpose, often glancing in my direction. I slept with my knife next to me and left at the crack of dawn the next morning. It might not sound as dramatic as seeing a ghost, but face to face with that man, miles from civilization, feeling that predatory energy directed at me, was one of the most unsettling experiences of my entire life. The monsters we should fear most are often the human ones. The world is full of shadows and whispers, things that lurk just beyond the firelight. These were just a few of them. If you've ever felt that chill run down your spine, if you've ever heard a sound you couldn't explain in the dead of night, you're not alone. Let us know about your own brush with the unexplained in the comments below. We read every single one. Don't forget to hit that like button if these stories kept you on the edge of your seat, and subscribe for more tales from the darkness. Ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the unknown. If you dare to listen again,